You're listening to The Tom Daniels Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. Recently, Fox News personality Brian Kilmeade wrote a book about the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington. Now, Roosevelt was on the board of trustees for Tuskegee Institute, and being from Tuskegee, I was naturally interested. Booker T. Washington is one of the most important figures in American history, and Tuskegee's my hometown. But then I learned something that surprised me. Kilmeade wrote an entire book about Booker T. Washington without ever once visiting Tuskegee. How do you do that? I mean, if President Roosevelt could come all the way to Tuskegee for a visit, you'd think Kilmeade could make it too. But no, he never walked downtown. He never toured the Oaks. He never talked to local people. He never sat on the campus. He never listened to the Tuskegee choir. He never ate at a local catfish fry. Man, I'm willing to bet he never drank a cup of red drink either. Maybe that doesn't bother anybody else, but that bothers me. My sister once said, "We may live in Auburn, but Tuskegee will always be our home." And she was exactly right. Tuskegee is my home. I've walked downtown. I've toured the Oaks twice. I've listened reverently to the Tuskegee choir. And today, I want to tell you something about Booker T. Washington that often gets overlooked. I want to talk about the music in the house of Booker T. Washington. Now, most people know Booker T. Washington as an educator. He was, Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee Institute, 1881. Yeah. Many know him as an author. Some know him as a political strategist. But few people realize how important music was to him, how deliberately he cultivated it at Tuskegee, and how that influence eventually reached all the way to one of the greatest musicians America's ever produced. And then, unexpectedly, to me. Booker T. Washington was born in 1856 in Franklin County, Virginia, and his first home was not a grand plantation house. It was a one-room cabin that served as slave quarters and kitchen. There was no parlor. There was no music room. There was certainly not a Steinway grand piano sitting in a corner. But there was definitely music. The kind of music that doesn't need instruments. The kind carried in voices. The kind passed from person to person across generations. Washington grew up surrounded by spirituals long before anybody called them spirituals. Years later, in his autobiography, Up From Slavery, he described these songs with remarkable clarity. Now, Washington was not a sentimental writer. He wasn't one of those fellows who used 10 pages when 2 paragraphs would do. When he wrote about the songs of enslaved people, he explained that they often carried hidden meanings and messages. They communicated things that could not safely be said aloud. In other words, these songs were not entertainment. They were communication. They were memory. They were survival. And Washington never forgot that. After emancipation, his family moved to Malden, West Virginia, where his stepfather worked in the salt furnaces. As a teenager, Washington made the long journey to Hampton Institute, traveling hundreds of miles with very little money and a tremendous amount of determination. Hampton took music seriously, not as a decoration, but not as something to fill time, as part of the education itself. The Fisk Jubilee Singers had already demonstrated that African American spirituals could captivate northern audiences and raise money for educational institutions, and Hampton understood that lesson, and so did Booker T. Washington. When he arrived at Tuskegee in 1881, he had almost nothing. No real campus, very little funding, a handful of students, a great deal of optimism, and one of the first things he organized was singing. 3 years after founding, he formed the Tuskegee Singers. Now, to be fair, there was a practical side to this. Tuskegee needed money, a lot of money, and the state was not exactly backing up dump trucks full of cash to the campus. So the Singers traveled north and helped raise funds. But Washington's commitment to music went much deeper than fundraising. He required the singing of spirituals in chapel services. He encouraged students to carry those songs into schools of their own. He repeatedly told people that these songs contained beauty that deserved preservation. And that's not how somebody talks about a fundraising tool. That's how somebody talks about a cultural inheritance. Booker T. Washington believed these songs mattered, and he spent his life making sure they survived. And now let's move from the campus to the house itself. The home of Booker T. Washington was called the Oaks. Now, if you've never visited, you really should. The Oaks was completed in 1899 and built largely by Tuskegee students. Like so much else at Tuskegee, the building itself was part of the educational process. I've toured the Oaks twice, and two things have always stayed with me. First, there's a little dining room, and around the upper walls are painted landscape scenes designed to look like windows opening into distant views. Now, most visitors just walk right past them and don't notice them, but I couldn't stop looking at them. There was something symbolic about a man who started with almost nothing, choosing to surround himself with images that suggested open horizons. The second thing I remember was the den, because that room served as Washington's home office. His secretary, Emmett Scott, worked there. Politicians visited there. Journalists visited there. Tuskegee visited there. After spending all day running Tuskegee Institute, Washington would come home and keep working. The nerve center of the most influential black institution in America operated partly from a den in a house in Tuskegee, Alabama. And that leads me to a remarkable piece of family history after this break. You're listening to The Tom Daniel Show, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Tom Daniel Show, and how did I not see that coming? This is an episode about Booker T. Washington, and Mary Mac just gave us Booker T. and the MGs. Of course they did. Mary Mac is the world's most perfect band. Now, among the people who corresponded with Booker T. Washington was William Bryant Riley, who was the superintendent of Macon County Schools. Riley was connected to my own family. His daughter Elizabeth married my grandfather's older brother Grady Dyson. Aunt Elizabeth was a fiery school teacher in Tuskegee and was known to her students as Dynamite Dyson. Well, anyway, her family, the Riley family, kept and preserved for more than a century a letter Booker T. Washington wrote to him on October 21st, 1915. The letter discusses student teachers, salaries, transportation expenses, and educational programs. It's nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. It's just work. The ordinary business of building schools. Washington thanked Riley for helping increase teacher pay from $10 a month to $15. He expressed gratitude. He discussed logistics, and he signed the letter. 24 days later, he was dead. That letter reminds me of something important. History is not made out of speeches. History is mostly made from paperwork. It's made out of budgets, salaries, transportation agreements, and people doing their jobs well enough that institutions survive after they're gone. And Booker T. Washington understood that better than almost anyone. But perhaps the most revealing musical story in the Washington household involved his daughter, Portia. Portia became an accomplished pianist. Now, Washington paid for her education. He sent her north. He ensured she received serious musical training. She eventually studied in Europe and became a respected music educator herself. Now think about that for a moment. The man who championed African American spirituals also invested heavily in classical piano training for his daughter, because he didn't see those traditions as enemies. He saw them as complementary. He understood both roots and branches. Which brings me to another name that belongs in this story, William Levi Dawson. Born in Anniston, Alabama in 1899, Dawson ran away from home at the age of 13 to study music at Tuskegee Institute. Not on a scholarship, not with his parents' blessing. He just showed up. He paid his tuition by working as a music librarian and a manual laborer in the agricultural division, and set about becoming a musician. Booker T. Washington was still alive when Dawson arrived on that campus. Let that sit for a moment. The young man who would eventually write one of the most important American symphonies of the 20th century came to Tuskegee because of what Washington had built. He learned within the culture Washington had created. He absorbed the same conviction Washington had carried since Hampton, that music was not decoration, but inheritance. After graduating from Tuskegee, William Dawson went on to the American Conservatory of Music in Chicago. He played trombone in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and worked on a symphony he called the Negro Folk Symphony. In 1930, Tuskegee invited him to come back. He accepted and became the first director of the newly established School of Music at Tuskegee Institute, and he built the Tuskegee Institute Choir into one of the finest choral ensembles in the country. That choir opened Radio City Music Hall in 1932. Hey, I didn't say they performed at Radio City Music Hall. I said they opened it. They inaugurated it on the very first night of its existence. They sang for presidents. They toured Europe and the Soviet Union under a State Department Goodwill Commission. And when the Negro Folk Symphony premiered with the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1934 under the baton of Leopold Stokowski, it was hailed as a landmark work, a composition that took the spiritual tradition Washington had spent his life protecting and elevated it to the full architecture of the orchestral stage by William Dawson. But that's not even what he was famous for. William Dawson completely reinvented how black spirituals were arranged and performed. He merged the same 18th and 19th century songs Booker T. Washington sang and merged them with 20th century harmony. It was a vocal revolution. Dawson eventually retired from Tuskegee in 1955, but he never left. He and his wife Cecile stayed in town for the rest of their long lives. And that brings me to the final chapter of this story. Now, my family owned Daniel's Clothing in downtown Tuskegee. My grandfather opened it in 1939, and my father took over in 1972. One of our regular customers was a pleasant, elderly gentleman named William Dawson. He came in for hats. He came in for socks, handkerchiefs. To us, he was just old Mr. Dawson. One afternoon, I was struggling with college music theory. I was having a hard time with a homework assignment, and my father listened to me complain for a while, and then he finally said, "Why don't you ask Mr. Dawson? He knows something about music." Yeah, something. That may be the greatest understatement in Alabama history. I was actually a little bit skeptical that this old man could help me with advanced music theory, but, I asked him anyway. He was standing right there. And Mr. Dawson played it cool. He said he could help a little. A little. The man who was a legend around the world for single-handedly reinventing spiritual chorale arrangements agreed to help me write a 4-part chorale for music theory. And I had no clue. For 3 weeks, I visited his home, 3 seemingly uneventful afternoons. He patiently helped me with my assignments. He even gave me a box of Pasantino music manuscript paper. He showed me artifacts from around the world. At one point, he casually handed me an object and said, The king of Ethiopia gave me that. Of course he did. And on one of those afternoons, Mr. Dawson placed into my hands his original handwritten manuscript of the Negro Folk Symphony. I held that thing in my hands. I looked at it. I was definitely impressed by it. But honestly, I had no clue of its significance or any idea how extraordinary that moment really was. That understanding came much later. By the time I understood what I'd been given, not the grade in music theory, not the lesson, but those 3 afternoons, the house, the hands that had made that score and then trusted mine with it, Dawson was gone. And the only way left to honor it was to understand it clearly and carry it forward as carefully as he had. The last thing he said to me on that last afternoon was, "Tell your choir director I said hello." I did. A couple of days later, I stopped the choir director and said, "Hey, William Dawson said to tell you hello." He froze. "You know William Dawson?" I'm still totally ignorant of everything. I casually told him of my 3 afternoons in Dawson's home, the music theory homework and the artifacts and compositions I'd held in my hands. I was actually a little bit worried that I'd get in trouble for getting somebody to help me on my homework. The man nearly collapsed right there on the sidewalk. He explained to me that William Dawson was a living legend and that he knew of no one that had ever been inside that home. Oh, now I started to get it. Booker T. Washington spent his life ensuring that a musical inheritance would survive. It survived in the Tuskegee Singers. It survived in the Tuskegee Choir. It survived in William Dawson. And through Dawson's generosity, it reached across to one bewildered, red-headed college student sitting at a kitchen table in his home in Tuskegee. That's how culture survives. Not through monuments, not through speeches, through people. One person teaching another. One generation passing something forward. 3 afternoons freely given. Booker T. Washington made sure the music had somewhere to go, and more than a century later, it is still going. This has been the Tom Daniel Show. Keep listening. Keep learning.